Every week, thousands of people ask us the most important question in the world. What can I do? So every week, I turn around and ask someone who actually knows what the hell they're talking about the very same question. Someone who has already answered it for themselves. Someone who's working on the front lines of the future in global health, climate change, AI, food and water, medicine, sustainable agriculture, Alzheimer's research, indigenous data, food stamps, electric school buses. I find out why they're doing the work they're doing and what we, you and I, can do to support it. So this week I want to know, what can we do about land power? It's the most important question. And I'm your host, Quinn Emmett. My guest today is Mike Albertus. Mike is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He's the author of the new book, Land Power: Who Has It, Who Doesn't, and How That Determines the Fate of Societies. Mike, welcome to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully you'll still feel that way at the end. So the goal really is, by the end of our conversation, for folks to have a little context for the work you do and why, but also why it's important. And then most importantly from there, really what they can do about it. The example I always use is it's kind of gnarly to be driving in your car listening to people talk about climate change for an hour, and then all of a sudden it's over. And you're just kind of like, well, maybe I'll just drive into that pole. So we want to give people some agency here. But before we get to that, again, we want to build some context. So I have my favorite two-part question for you. And it actually is the same question, so you got to listen carefully. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. The first part is, why do you have to do this job? So of everyone in the world, why you be the land guy? And two, why do you have to do this work? So of all the ways that you could have answered the call, why this work in particular? Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Hit me.
Yeah, and a great question. So, I study how countries allocate opportunity and well-being among their citizens and the consequences that has for a society. And that involves understanding things like how government works across both democracy and dictatorship, the inequality and redistribution connection, and what supports long-run economic and political development. And I took a very unusual route to get here. I started in my earlier, as an undergraduate, studying mathematics and electrical engineering. And it gave me a very systematic way of thinking about the world and a rigorous way for thinking about the world. I was then became fascinated by things that were going on more broadly internationally, in the Middle East, in the invasion of Iraq. And I got hooked on politics. And, when I went to graduate school, I was interested in learning about everywhere in the world. And I started doing field work to learn more about why it is that democracies are oftentimes don't live up to our expectations when it comes to delivering policy quickly.
Yeah.
And I was traveling in Latin America, and everywhere you see, or everywhere at the time, I was seeing pretty significant poverty and glaring inequality. And I was trying to figure out how that could coexist with democracy for such a long period of time. And so as I was trying to get into all of that, I was thinking about how would we get a sense of, the policies that a government is delivering? How are they trying to address inequalities? And I was traveling in part into some rural areas, and I was seeing that the state and governments oftentimes don't reach these areas. They have a very limited grasp on what's going on in some of these places. They don't often know their citizens, or they neglect them. And people many times didn't have a voice. And repeatedly, when I started to delve into that more and return to the field, oftentimes I remember, for example, when I went to La Paz in Bolivia, and I was working with a land reform agency there, and there was a big group of peasants who were basically banging on the front desk trying to get access to their papers. And, the bureaucrats sitting there trying to ignore people, and then they let me into the archives where I could look at everybody's, papers and stuff. And so my training, sort of my math, my engineering, it led me to be able to kind of systematize data and think about data and the allocation of things like land, which is what my new book, Land Power, is about, in kind of unique ways, I think, for someone who comes at the world from a political angle.
Hmm.
And that's something I think that has, is reflected in my work and provides a
Hmm.
little bit of a unique background.
I love that. That's amazing perspective. It's always just so fascinating. I'm so lucky. Again, I've done about 200 of these. Sometimes it's not the hero's journey, the catalyst, or my wife's her screenwriter, the inciting incident. Sometimes it's not applicable at all. And sometimes there's such a direct through line to why someone does what they do, or, as I,
Yeah.
mine is much more indirect, but either way, as a college friend put it recently, I signed up to write a term paper every week for the rest of my life, which in retrospect feels not great, but here we are. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate that. It's always great to, whatever the route, to find someone who has clearly like a festering wound about something in particular that is so applicable to everything, right? I mean, it's land. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. So let's get a big picture with this. So besides obvious finite scarcity, we live in a world that's 70% water. Why, in your view, has land remained such a potent source of influence across all these vastly different cultures and historical periods? You start with Mesopotamia right up to, Los Angeles after the fires, and Manhattan commercial real estate after COVID. What's the
Right.
through line there?
Yeah, I mean, the through line really is that land is power, that people are and societies are rooted in the land and always have been. The relationships with land have changed a lot over the course of human history. Relationships used to be much more sort of diffuse territorial relationships. People used to
Mm-hmm.
move oftentimes with the movements of, herds of animals, for
Mm-hmm.
example, or seasonally. But, in more recent centuries, as populations have grown, land has become comparatively more scarce. And, ever since the rise of agriculture, the appropriation of surplus from land has been key to power and the generation of power, the use of power, the projection of power, as well as power dynamics within society. So that, certainly by the last, as of several centuries ago, land became deeply interwoven with economic, social, and political power. And because land is power, those who come to dominate these forms of, social, those who own it come to dominate these forms of social, political, and economic power, whereas those who don't become dominated. And again, that's something that repeats itself again and again in human societies.
You talk quite a bit, and again, someone who kind of went sideways with things. I was a religious studies major. I anticipated doing political science or something like that, and I'm about as pagan atheist as it gets, but I understood that, like land, kind of this explains a lot, through so much. So I appreciated your idea of sort of the original sins of land seizure, like consuming indigenous lands, and how they continue after all this time to shape racial hierarchies, wealth gaps, political power, and especially now when we see that obviously in the US, it turns out, so much wealth has been generated through land. Talk to me about sort of the particular through lines in a place like the US versus Europe versus Asia.
Yeah. So, it's hard to overstate how concentrated land was in, much of Europe, Latin America, East Asia, as of a few centuries ago. A very small number of landowners owned the vast majority of the land, and other people owed their livelihoods in most cases to those people who were toiling on that land. Whether we're talking about feudalism in Europe or whether we're talking about kind of landlord tenant relationships in East Asia or the hacienda system or something like that in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And then in what I talk about in the book as the Great Reshuffle, this period of the enormous upheaval in the ownership of land that came with these driving factors like population growth and state making and social conflict. Those factors all drove an increasing demand for land and an increasing ability of the state to reallocate and reassign that land. And though that then drove a reshuffling in land in just about every society on Earth. And it happened in different ways. In East Asia, for example, ranged everything from, let's say, land collectivization after China's civil war to, the granting of land to tenants after World War II in places like Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And we can see the extremely divergent consequences between, say, China and, Taiwan and South Korea and Japan over the course of many decades, right? Very much deeply related to how they dealt with land. In Europe, there were a number of efforts to reallocate land, everything from the French Revolution to, post-war Italy, and, pressures on land in places like Spain and Portugal, et cetera. So in the United States, reshuffling took a bit of a different pattern, a different trajectory than it did in, let's say, Europe or in East Asia. In the U.S., it looked more like the, land settlement or the, colonialism, right? In the sense that, people came from, Europe and settled on the eastern seaboard and, displaced indigenous peoples as they moved west. But then how land was allocated among settlers generated very different trajectories within America. So in New England, you had relatively equal land holding and a radical experiment in democracy. In the South, you had the creation of the plantation system that was based on slavery. And, that ultimately led to Jim Crow and later the Civil Rights era. And in the American West, you had, the large scale appropriation of indigenous land and the creation of the reservation system and the like. So, these initial patterns of landholding concentration then were broken up in different ways. And that had really important consequences for how societies came to be structured.
It's funny. I've been talking to my 12-year-old a lot recently about he's gradually wants to understand what sort of the next level of great, meaningful movies are, right? To go from Star Wars and Marvel to other things. It basically started, and I wrote about this, he wants to watch Jaws. And I was like, that's great. But just so you know, you can't unsee Jaws. It's not like stormtroopers getting blown up, whatever. Like you're a kid who loves the ocean. And the other example I use with him, and again, he hasn't seen it, is I'm like, I love that you're learning about World War II, but we can watch Saving Private Ryan when you're ready. But those first 20 minutes, were intended to completely revisit that in a way that you can't forget.
Right.
And obviously, trying to explain now, I mean, it's been so long, but how impactful World War II was. And so that I was so interested in, like you mentioned, Japan's post-war land to the tiller reforms, this crazy high-speed development, I guess up until the 90s or so, versus how in the Soviet Union, the collective farms, not so much famine, coercion, and, at least we got great TV series, The Americans, out of it. But talk to me about how those contrast. Like, where do they diverge? Like, what are the decisions that were made that really made them diverge so much in their impact?
So a lot of it had to do with how land was reallocated. In both cases, whether you're talking about Japan or Russia, we had extreme landholding concentration, let's say, well through the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And in Russia, we had the Bolshevik Revolution. We had large land holdings that were seized en masse. Those were distributed, across the country. And then when Stalin came along, he decided to push people into collectives and forge collective agriculture. And so that involved uprooting people from their, specific plots of land and pushing them into collective farming. And that was very useful for the Soviet Union because it enabled the Soviet Union to reach deep into those collectives, to extract surplus, and to use it to fuel investment in industry and the like. And that very much advanced, in some ways, certain aspects of development in the Soviet Union at the same time as it caused enormous problems in agriculture. And, you still had quite a substantial population living in rural areas. So it generated all these distortions, all these problems. It fueled industrialization, it also fueled agricultural underproductivity, and it fueled environmental problems ultimately, because as agricultural collectives were underproducing, there was an incentive to try and increase that by putting under farming more land, and throwing fertilizer on the land and all that kind of stuff. And it fueled authoritarianism. It really fueled the project of the Soviet Union to extend its power, in different places across the world. And that's very different from what happened in post-war Japan, where the U.S. As an occupying authority encountered this system that was similar in many ways to feudalism, in which there were a very small number of very influential large landowners, politically powerful large landowners that were economically dominant in the Japanese economy. And it became clear that that had to change in order to lay the groundwork for democracy and for a more egalitarian and inclusive form of development. And so, the Japan instituted these very draconian limits to the amount of land that individuals could own. And so, max was just a few acres of land. And as a result, all of a sudden, everyone who was, paying extremely high rates as a tenant working the land, that was owned by some large landowner, they now became owners of their own right of that land. And they could afford to send their kids not to the farms, but rather to schools. And within a generation, that started to have enormous payoffs in terms of transforming the Japanese economy towards one of greater industrialization, greater urbanization, much greater productivity, in such a way that land became actually less important over time, consequently. So it was a very different, that allocation to families and empowering people in Japan was so different than what happened in terms of the efforts at domination and extraction in Russia from people who worked on those farms, and that had these huge consequences.
It's amazing how little we learn the lessons of time. Yet in some ways we do, in some ways we don't. And then you look at what is the United States' biggest voting bloc. What is their greatest concern? And obviously, the geography and political systems, which change in each country over time, obviously, in so many ways, influence so much of this. But it does seem like, and we'll get to this, there may be some best practices that we've picked up on that are, I don't want to say lowest common denominator, but hopefully applicable in more places. I want to focus on the U.S. a little bit here. So I'm sure you've had so much time with young children and writing this book, but two of my favorite books of the past 10 years are by an author named Isabel Wilkerson. She wrote Caste, and she wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, which really expanded on the Great Migration, right?
Yeah.
So the story of African Americans in the United States moving from, I'm from Virginia here, but mostly the Deep South, the Jim Crow South, to the West and the North. You wrote about the Great Shuffle, the Great Reshuffle, right? Talk to me a little bit about, because again, everybody hears about redlining, everybody hears about systematic marginalization from AI or machine learning in mortgage applications and insurance. Like, we make it so complicated, but it's fairly simple. It's the deprivation of land. Talk to me about sort of how those two have intersected to really give us context for, at least, obviously it goes back further, but the past 70 years.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll even go back a little bit further to set the stage, if that's all right. So, obviously so as I mentioned previously, the Deep South was characterized by the plantation system for, quite a long period of time prior to the Civil War. And at the end of the Civil War, with the emancipation of blacks, there was initially an attempt by the government to grant people 40 acres and a mule, right? To grant formerly enslaved people land and animals to help work it. And that was, that plan moved forward very, very briefly in a select part of the South. And then it was quickly abandoned. And as a result, that promise was never met, and many formerly enslaved blacks ended up back as sharecroppers, many times for the same plantation owners. And so that failure to reconcile with that deep inequality in access to the fundamental engine of economic mobility and social mobility, which was land, had enormous consequences that then helped to drive the Great Migration due to the lack of opportunity and the suffocating political atmosphere environment of the Jim Crow era, right? And then, as people moved to northern cities, there was an effort to keep them out, right? And that was also an effort that was rooted in land. And that was through things like, you mentioned redlining. It was also through other sorts of zoning restrictions, on what could be built in different areas in order to marginalize certain communities, right? And we see that today. We see the same patterns of segregation that are persisting today in our cities that map onto, forms of discriminatory policing, that map onto forms of, unequal access to, financial instruments and that sort of thing. So in many ways, we are still living the consequences of our failure to grapple with the reallocation, the reshuffling of land in the wake of the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing how much of what this country is still dealing with, I guess, like kind of deciding not to deal with on a pretty frequent basis, traces back to giving up on Reconstruction. I've got a bunch of books I can put in the show notes about it, but that is really just such an essential talk about. It's not the original sin, but one of them, and we really did bail on that. It's amazing. I had a year or two ago, I don't know, time means nothing anymore. I had on a gentleman who, similar to you, but even nerdier and deeper, but the Great American Transit Disaster, wrote really the manifesto on why we purposefully abandoned public transportation and how so much of it was because of race, whether it's, even with the systems that still remain in Boston, Chicago, New York, why Atlanta doesn't have what it has and all this other stuff. So of all these different systems and processes, does it seem like there's any point at which these land grabs fade away? Or do you see them? I mean, a lot of what I write about is like, we are who we are. We make a lot of the same decisions over and over again. Are they permanently embedded in our institutions and social structures? Are there any examples of starting to reconcile with the decisions we made before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that in many ways we can see the shadows of these past land grabs for very long periods of time, right? It's clear that they don't go away within a generation or two and that they continue to fester. They oftentimes are reshaped, are refashioned in different ways, as we talked about with the Great Migration, right? And what happened in northern cities as a reflection of what happened in the South or failed to happen in the South after the Civil War. So in many ways, we still live with that. But there are also, of course, efforts to grapple with the past and to reconcile with it and trying to address it in different ways. Oftentimes the solutions that are available down the line have to reflect not only what initially happened, but also all of the reality that transpired in the intervening period, right? So as people, let's say, were spread out across the land, as cities have been built, as property has transferred hands, et cetera. And so, I could give you, if you think about, let's say, in the American context again, how, the government is dealing with relationships with Native American tribes, right? Mm-hmm. So that is something, that history of dispossession and displacement happened a long time ago, but it's still very much relevant to the day-to-day lives of people who are members of these tribal nations, right? And as a result, in some cases, the government has, the federal government has come to work with tribes to co-manage public lands or national monuments, like Bear Ears National Monument, for example, is, defined in part by a co-stewardship arrangement with a series of Native American tribes, right, that have ancestral claims over that land. And so there are, modern day, I hate to say solutions per se, because these aren't fix-all sorts of things, but reconciliation, right, or an attempt at recognizing and addressing in certain ways aspects of the past.
I appreciate your focus on how the word solution doesn't quite get it done, and I think about that all of the time when everyone asks me about climate solutions, and I'm like, there's so much we can do. I'm not sure. It's like Princess Bride. Like, I'm not sure that word means what you think it means anymore, because what is like a solution? And I know you've written a lot about potential things we can do. You wrote about, I believe you wrote quite frequently about, we could use, what is it, a 1/10% of public land in the West to help with housing and things like that. But
right.
Again, look, the indigenous land grabs, again, I'm in colonial Williamsburg. Jamestown's down the street. There's plantations just over the bridge. I get it. But we're in the thick of it, and we're wrestling with it, and it's really, really complicated. It's funny. It's not funny. I spent 15 years in Los Angeles, and two things really come to mind before I move on to sort of the next big glaring piece of this. And one is, I'm sure you heard about, there was a piece of land that was owned by a black family for a very long time, like on the water just south of LA, that was taken from them. And, the surrounding real estate became wildly profitable, for lack of a better word, in 1,000 different ways. And the family in many different groups over the years have fought to get that family back to or that land back to them. And then they got it back a few years ago. It was incredible. It was given back to them. I mean, just unreal real estate. And then I guess on the surface, it's surprising, but when you think about it, it isn't. They then decided to sell it back because what had transpired over time is families grow and they become, more diverse and numerous, and it becomes really complicated. And it turns out one of the best things, what was really denied from them was not the land, it was the wealth that you could build from it.
Yeah.
And they could gain a little of that, not back, but in the moment by selling it and distributing it among the family. And I'll put something else in there, but it really brings to mind, we had quite a few friends lose houses in the past couple months in the LA fires, and the neighborhood of Altadena, this just beautiful, semi-affordable part of the city where there were so many generational black homes, and those are gone, and a lot of schools are gone, things like that. And it's not just those particular homes; it's that those opportunities really do not exist anymore, even with everything we've learned, because of how systemic these issues still are in so many ways.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I could give you, easily a dozen examples of other places that I've studied where we see similar kinds of dynamics, where societies simply change between the time of dispossession and the time of repossession, if it happens, right?
Yeah.
So another place that I did field work for the book was South Africa, and I worked with a set of communities in the Mpumalanga region of South Africa. And, they had been forcibly displaced under apartheid in 1954. And the government came with a bunch of trucks and carted them off their land and, gave it to white settlers. And, land changed hands a couple times. It ended up in the hands of an agribusiness that started growing sugarcane at a commercial scale. And, circa 2008, when this land was handed back to communities, people didn't have training in commercial sugarcane. It didn't exist at the time they were displaced in that area. And they had, many people had moved to other places. And so the communities decided to take the land back and lease it back to the company and gain revenue from that leasing arrangement. And there are a number of other dynamics tied into it, but it's a common story, whether it's in South Africa or in many other places that, again, the society that you start with at the time of land, displacement and removal is different from the one later on, and interests are different as well. And so, when people come back to that land or that ownership, then it might mean something very different in this new context, right?
Yeah, and look, the land back movements are incredible and complicated and simple and complicated, and we are obligated to not just execute on the surface level land back, but also to say, sorry, there's 4 empty malls on it. You should not be obligated, now that you're the steward of this land again, to deal with that shit. Like that was our failed use of it. And by the way, the land is also different over time. God knows like what we've done to some of this stuff. So there's a big glaring point I want to get to here, which is you only have to watch so many BBC shows to realize and remember that, especially, and in the US too, land was basically just handed out to white guys. Yeah. What is it about us, I guess, that makes it so difficult still to incorporate women's rights specifically across the world in these small scale or large scale land transitions? And are there any especially effective, again, solutions, fixes for empowering women through property rights that you've run into?
Yeah, so the political, the social, the economic power of land means that it cuts these deep ruts in society along major identity markers like race and also like gender, right? And so we see, time and again, whether it's in the United States, Canada, South Africa, and Australia and other places, when we see the large scale appropriation and reallocation of land to settlers, the overwhelming bulk of recipients are white men in these cases, right? Through the course of kind of the colonial era. And, in some cases that was a relic of, who was out there settling the land. But in other cases that was even deepened by explicit state policies banning women from getting access to land. And that's what happened, let's say, in Canada, right? So Canada, like in the US, had a Homestead Act in the 1870s, and over the subsequent 75 years doled out hundreds of millions of acres of land, but they expressly forbid women from homesteading, single women from homesteading. And so as a result, almost all this land went to men. And you see that decades later in social economic statistics about the welfare gap between men and women, right? And so, but there are countries who are trying to address that issue in serious and significant ways, right? So let me give you a different example. A different example would be Bolivia, right? So Bolivia is a country where there was a revolution in 1952. They had this legacy of very unequal landholding from the Spanish colonial era that persisted all the way to the 1950s. That land was then, taken from people who had kind of colonial roots. It was granted to people, but people didn't get titles over that land, and it was basically granted to men. When Evo Morales, the first indigenous leader in Bolivia's independence era, came into power in the 2000s, he came into power in part with support from social movements that were empowering women. And women said, hey, we also want access to land. And land is this asset that can empower us economically and both within the household as well as outside of it. And as a result, the government went about undertook this enormous land titling effort to formalize all this land in the countryside, and they started jointly titling property to men and women. So all of a sudden, women become huge property owners in Bolivia, and other countries are doing that as well. So one very simple, well, at least theoretically, right, very complicated in practice,
right,
is to incorporate women in land titles, right, in property titles, in house titles, in car titles, you name it. Giving people, writing people onto the deed of a property has implications for gender relationships and mobility, gender mobility within society. And so that's a very simple thing,
right? Compared to everything else, it really is. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah. And again, that can extend for quite a while. It's all relative. Like, we have to take the low hanging fruit where we can get it, because we have to start somewhere, right? And we have to start doing these things that are again not lowest common denominator, but are broadly applicable and repeatable in a lot of different places. Yeah. So I want to get to more about restitution and reparation of land to people, but I'm also, as we work towards sort of solutions and answering, what can we do? I'm curious, where have you seen land-related policies genuinely boost environmental resilience versus continuing to degrade it in so many places? And obviously the potpourri, the variety of ways we have degraded it is almost endless. But I'm curious, like, we need, and my friend Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson has done a lot of work on this with urban and coastal stuff, but solutions that help with biodiversity loss and resource depletion, and obviously sea level rise and drought and things like that. Right. So how would you fix it?
Yeah, this is another, that's a softball right there.
Yeah, go get him.
This is one of these things where solutions, I think, elude us in the sense of complete fixes, right? So you think about the United States and the loss of, the prairies, basically almost the entire prairies, and the biodiversity that the prairies supported was almost completely lost in the settlement of the Western United States, right? There's no way in which you can recuperate that really at an ecosystem level in the ways that would look anything like it did previously. And so as a result, the sort of policies that are available to us are in some sense policies that aren't complete fixes, right? And so we have this history of the past that we have to grapple with. That being said, there are many policy ideas that are out there that are being enacted in ways that are helpful. So let me give you an example. One example is from Chile, where I did field work for the book as well, in Patagonia National Park. So in 2014, about 6% of Chile's, land mass and coastal ecosystems were protected under congressional designations. But there had been an effort at preservation, land preservation, ecosystem conservation in Chile, and that had been pushed in part by a pair of American philanthropists, Chris and Doug Tompkins, the founder of North Face and the first CEO of Patagonia. They had started, in the 90s, buying up large tracts of land in the Patagonia region, principally in Chile, for the purposes of conservation there. And, over the course of, 20 years or more, they ultimately came to a deal with the Chilean government to grant that land over to the government in exchange for the government promising to both protect that land, conserve it, put it in park as a parkland designation, as well as to protect more land beyond that. And as part of that deal, the government created this thing called the Route of Parks, which is now, parks that span over 1,500 kilometers north to south across Patagonia. That's come to preserve over 30% now of the country's land and conserve the ecosystems that are in there. And that not only do that, but that also, where there has been land degradation, like Patagonia National Park, which was previously a ranch, basically a sheep ranch at a large scale, that had led to a lot of degradation of local ecosystems and loss in biodiversity, to rewild those areas, right? To open them back up to species, and to tear down fencing and to reintroduce species. And that has been, really quite successful. And so now, people are coming to visit these areas and enjoy them and experience them, and then leave them and try and leave no trace as they visit, right? So that's, and that's a model, I should say, that other countries are starting to look towards, like China, Canada, Norway, all have in the works major national park systems that are coming up in the next 10 or 15 years that in part look to this example, right? So in other cases, that's not possible everywhere, where, where land is now under, private ownership at an extremely large scale, and it's fractionated, like in the US. That's much more difficult. So in the US, when it comes to, preserving biodiversity and the like, we have to think more along the lines of land trusts and conservation easements and that sort of thing. And so the tools that you're going to use in any particular context are going to vary, but there are many policy ideas that are out there.
I love that example. That is someplace I have always wanted to go.
It's stunning. Get there. It's amazing.
It sounded incredible. I also recently read, this is mostly off topic, The Wager. Did you read about that? Shipwreck book.
Yes.
Off the coast of Patagonia. Not great.
Doesn't.
No, thank you. That's a no for me. I want to go there. Not like that. No, thank you. So that's great. Again, it's really exciting to hear about rewilding, and it's happening in Scotland and Chile and all these different things. But like you said, there's a lot of places, I don't want to say are too far gone, though I think that obviously applies in a lot of ways, that may take well beyond our lifetimes, which is okay as long as we get started. Or again, like you said, in the US, we've made land so complicated between private ownership and commercial and industry and things like that it's going to take a creative arrangements. So let's talk about answering what we call the most important question, which is, what can I do? What can we do? And so we typically try to align with how our app, which is whatcanIdo.earth, how it works, which is along these specific verbs, as we call them. Imagine it's like Mad Libs, which is to be heard, which is talking to your representatives at every level about really specific measurable policies. Donating to places that are, again, reputable and often doing work on the front lines by people who are on the front lines and are of them. Volunteering and organizing, getting educated, which is a great first step. Talk to me about, in a world where people can either and feel overwhelmed or impotent about things like this, what are the most practical ways our listeners can push for more equitable land use policies? Let's start in their own communities.
Yeah, I love that question. So, land in many ways can feel like this kind of abstract concept. It can feel like something big and distant in the ways we've been talking about it. But it's important to keep in mind that everybody is rooted in the land. Everybody lives in a space, right, that is tied to land, and that in many ways identity is formed around land. And that land has a history too. And that land has been changing in many ways since its settlement. And so there are many things that people can do, with their own property or in their own community in order to try and address some of the issues that we've been talking about here. So it could be everything like, hey, put your partner on the house title, right? On the
Truly.
house deed.
Yep.
To hey, planting a garden in your yard, or reconsider that grass, plant
Sure.
a pollinator friendly space. To what are you eating in your home, right? How do we think about consumption and food and land use? About almost 30% of all land in the United States is used for either grazing or raising cattle, mainly for beef consumption. And so cutting down on, eating one less, serving of beef a week actually has a big impact on land use. Also thinking about, the history of the land that you are on, right? Find out who lived there previously, what indigenous community lived there. Read a little bit about how they were displaced, and think about donating to a tribal council or tribal initiatives that are many times still active in those same places, right? You can support climate action by donating to, organizations like the World Wildlife Fund or Tompkins Conservation, which was critical in the creation of that Patagonia National Park, or, broader campaigns like Stand for Her Land campaign, which is a campaign to empower women's access to property in societies around the globe. So there are many things that you can do, even from your own home, in order to impact these issues.
I love that. What about it sort of, without getting too far into it, the federal level's a little bit of a shit show at the moment. We really like trying to operate as much as we can at the state level. Pros and cons of federalism here. But obviously that's as much as we look for sort of repeatable, not cookie cutter, but repeatable policies and principles that can be operated in as many different states as possible. Obviously, they're all very different. What have you found sort of at the state level, which is kind of that in between where people can be effective? What should they be talking to their representatives about?
Yeah. It depends on the land issues that you're most passionate about, and the
Okay.
land related issues that you're most passionate about. So let's say if you're passionate about restitution and dealing with, dispossession of indigenous communities, you can look to places like the state of California and how they have incorporated indigenous communities into, again, the stewardship and management of public lands, right? And that's a state level decision, and state representatives are making decisions about that are consequential decisions for, the involvement of these communities in places that they've been displaced from, right? And what that looks like in terms of, is it simply, is there some sort of management that goes on over those lands, or maybe there's revenue streams that help to reconstitute, community life that has been, that has declined as a result of, of land settlement in those places? Or you could think about, back to the environmental questions, a place like Minnesota, for example, is quite active in trying to create conservation easements. So property owners can strike deals with, the Department of Natural Resources on how to deal with their own property in terms of, preserving, let's say, wetlands or watersheds that are on their property. You can think about, how to support local farmers and in practices like regenerative agriculture. So not just local and organic, but also ways to actually try and regenerate the soils and watersheds that have been depleted over the course of many decades through settlement. So again, it depends on what you're passionate about, but there's really plenty out there.
Yeah, there's lots to do. I also
Yeah.
think, I wonder, public records wise, how many states are really aware of just surface level, and what kind of research can they conduct about what percentage of private land is owned by men still? Just awareness wise, I wonder what kind of study can be done there to just get somebody to go through it and say like, hey, look, it's 90%, is
Yeah.
just white men. Like,
Right.
I'm curious. And again, like that might seem like a waste of time to some folks, but it is amazing how far awareness on its own can go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you can see some of this stuff, there's obviously, county level property registers
Mm-hmm.
that people can go sift through and look at
Mm-hmm.
these sorts of things. You can expand that beyond,
Mm-hmm.
any given county. There are many ancestral records too that
Sure.
are online, census-based records that can help to shed light on some of these questions as well. And so as people are looking at their own family histories, they might consider some of these questions in their own family histories and family trees.
I mean, just the fact that my wife lets me stay in our house is shocking to me every day. So this is the least I can do is try to pay it back in some way.
Right.
Truly, I wake up every day and I'm like, why are
You and
you
me
still
both.
here? How do you, it's just, there's so many crocs everywhere in our house. All right. So Mike, we have a last few questions we ask everybody that aren't directly related, but a little more related to, you know, you and doing this work
Sure.
and finding your way in. And then we're going to get you out of here. When was the first time in your life when you really realized you had what we call the power of change or the power to do something meaningful outside yourself? Could have been, running for office in fifth grade or anything like that. When you realized, oh, look what I can do, or with a team of people, look what we can do.
Really impactful one for me, or one that I remember very, very concretely, is came through in sort of a chance meeting in many ways through someone who I met in the highlands of Peru, about an hour and a half outside of Cusco. And I was doing field work at a former hacienda, former large property that was expropriated by the government there in the early 1970s and turned over to people who were basically forcibly working that land. And I met a woman who was in her early 70s who told me about her life growing up on that property, right? And, basically having to work without pay 6 days a week for this landowner, as she put it, working her like a donkey in the fields, day after day. And it was such a powerful experience because she was standing under, she was standing in this former ruins of this hacienda,
Mm,
and a place where she had, been grown up in almost slave-like sort of conditions, under this portrait of the dictator who was the one who actually reallocated that land. And she was telling me her story, and and I asked her, hey, can I use this material? And that material ended up in my first book, and it ended up a photo of her at the gate of this former hacienda is the image on the cover of my first book. And it's this powerful image of how the tide can turn on
mm,
the
mm-hmm,
land, and
mm-hmm.
how change can be so prefer for her. This change in the land and the ownership of the land was her life. It was
Sure.
everything to her. And I've had many people ask me about that cover since, and I have had people read that book and say, hey, that has impacted how I've done work. And so it made me realize the power of the ability to tell a story from
Mm-hmm.
of somebody who doesn't have a prominent voice, and who throughout the course of her life was someone who owed much of her life to someone who was more powerful. So that to me felt like a big transformation and a big moment of change, both
Mm-hmm.
in her life, in that society, and in the very little way of me being able to kind of highlight that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, it's amazing how one story can go so far, and again, go even beyond you. However much intentionally it impacts folks. That's awesome. Last one, again, with all the time you have, what is a book you've read in the past year or so that has either opened your mind to a topic you hadn't considered before, or changed your thinking in some way, or it could just be like me, fiction about dragons that turns your brain off at night?
Yeah,
And we've got a whole list up
sure,
on
sure.
Bookshop.
I find it so difficult to read with really little kids in the house and trying to get things done. But one book that I read that was a couple of years ago, but that was really a fascinating book, and I found made me think in a lot of interesting ways, was Barbarian Days: Surfing Life by William Finnegan. I'm not sure if
Okay.
you've ever
Yeah, yeah.
read
I've
that
heard of it.
book,
I haven't
but
read it. Yeah.
yeah, it's a fantastic book. The writing is just enthralling
Hmm.
in many different ways. I'm not a surfer, although I'm a
Hmm.
person who loves the outdoors.
Hmm.
And I found that a lens into that world to be so evocative in ways
Hmm.
that I had never anticipated. But the thing that made me really love the book is the fact that it's such an intellectually engaged path through a physical world, right? It's
Hmm.
so it's so engaged with the different places that he's at. And, he was a longtime journalist who studied, pretty deeply and covered the areas that he ultimately ended up going to surf as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this fascinating combination of things. But again, to me, it paints this really vivid picture of life from a different angle that I hadn't previously considered. And that for me is sort of motivating and in many ways for thinking about how to engage in the broader world.
It's incredible how many different perspectives there are if we just think about it without even going, whatever they call it, woke as you need to be. I mean, I was thinking recently, my uncle is a extremely small minority owner of a low-level British soccer team. And finances are very tight. But the one thing is non-negotiable is the field. It's the pitch, as they call it. And I remember him describing to me no one knows more about grass than these groundkeepers who don't have billions in Saudi money to replace it every year. And you're like, yeah, this person, their experience of this land is so beyond mine, and what other versions of that are there out there, right? Yes. Folks like that. It's incredible. Yeah, I love it. I'm sure you've stumbled on this because it's so much bigger than it was then. Audiobooks when you have small children, I poo-poo them like so many morons. And then a buddy who had older kids than mine was like, try listening to them and no one can ask you questions. And it was amazing. Audiobooks.
Yeah. Yes, totally. I'm into that podcast all the time, where I can get it.
It's truly wherever you can get it. We just actually launched our second ever podcast. It's called, it's a parenting podcast. And it's basically parenting in these specific times. It's our way of broadening the funnel of people we're reaching and then radicalizing them towards taking action. But we're calling it Not Right Now because that's what you end up saying to your children 470 times a day. But it's also what you say to the notifications on your phone when you're actually trying to be a parent is no, I don't need democracy tweets right now, please.
It's such a strange time to be a parent.
It's very strange. And now they're old enough to ask questions, and that's just exhausting.
Yeah, right around the corner for me.
Yeah,
I'm bracing.
Good luck. Good luck with that. Yeah, we almost called it Because I Said So, which felt a little harsh. So I don't have answers for you, man. My children will definitely tell you I don't have answers. This has all been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Is there anything I missed? Anything you want to leave us with?
I guess I would say, hey, everybody's got a history. You don't have to dig very deep to find it. And, you could learn so much about it too. I mean, it's been fun actually in my own family history. My dad has been kind of nerding out on family ancestry for the last 15 years or so since he retired, and even a little bit before that. And, most recently, he traced, his family basically back to serfdom under, basically under Russian occupation of Poland. And so this stuff is fascinating. Recently dug up land records on that, in the last year. So, and, not very long ago, a couple generations. And there's a story, there's a through line directly from there to where we're at, in my family. And so I found that to be really insightful and fascinating. So I would encourage, people to think along similar lines in their own lives.
Sure. I love that. Well, thank you for all this. Your book is on sale, right? And it's on sale in the UK now as well, right?
Yep. It's in the US, it's in the UK. It's an audiobook, ebook, hardcover, you name it. Yeah. So I'd love to hear anybody that's feedback as well. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah. And we'll put up all the links to it. We usually use a bookshop and things like that to try to,
Great.
Not support the monsters. Where else online? Do you do any other work people can follow? I know you Substack and some things like that.
Yeah, I go to Substack, The Good Society. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky. I've got a website and all that good stuff. So awesome. The Substack is kind of devoted to the more here and now, US, a bit more US focus on current policy debates and how they relate to the land, but more broadly to our political atmosphere, our political environment, which, hey, as you know, plenty going on.
It's just a delight. Thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome. It is really one of those things I have to be very careful. I don't start pulling the string on because I'll just disappear, right down land use. Forever.
I get it. Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. It was a fascinating conversation.
That's it for this week's conversation. For more conversations, scroll back in the feed, or visit podcast.importantnotimportant.com to search by name, topic, whatever. Thanks for sharing, thanks for leaving a review, and thanks for giving a shit.